Hi, Ben here from Trident Fly Fishing, back with another episode of Talking Trident, where we take your questions and answer them right here in the studio. Today we're going to be taking a look at steelhead fly lines, and we're going to answer your question of what is the best steelhead line. So the first thing to consider is going to be whether or not you're using a two-handed rod, a spay or switch rod, or a single-handed rod. And obviously, two-handed lines are going to be a lot different than single-handed lines. And in this video, we're going to cover both, but just so you're aware, if we're talking about Skagit or Scandi, that's probably not what you're going to want for your single-hander. And the next thing to consider is going to be your presentation. Are you going to be swinging a streamer, skating a dry fly, or fishing an indicator? And that's going to have a big impact on which line to choose. In the single-hand world, most people are going to be fishing an indicator. So you'll see a lot of your steelhead lines are geared towards indicator fishing. One of our favorite lines, this SA Anadro here, has a really long head, but a lot of weight forward. And that's going to be designed to turn over those big indicator rigs with ease. Similarly, if you're swinging a heavy fly, you're going to want to make sure that you've got enough mass forward in that fly line to make that happen. For fishing dry flies, on the other hand, you can use a line that's totally different and way lighter. Rio makes this line here called the Salmo Steelhead with that exact purpose in mind. It's got a really long head and it's fairly light. What that does is enable you to pick up the line easily off the water and recast over and over again. If you're just getting into steelhead fishing, you might find this line a little bit tough to cast though. And it's going to be especially bad at shorter distances. On the two-handed side of things, almost everybody is going to fish with some sort of a Skagit head. And the reason for that is most people are going to be swinging with their two-hander, and Skagit heads really allow you to fish those weighted flies and big heavy tips with ease. Now, similar to the single-hand world, fishing a Scandi head that's a full floater is going to be better for dry fly fishing than that Skagit. It's going to give you a better presentation. It's going to be more fun to cast. And for Scandi stuff, I really like lines like this Gale Force ESH. It's just a superb Scandi taper. The next thing you should consider is where you're fishing and how tight those conditions are. And this mostly applies to the single-hand world, but it does have an analogy in spay as well. But fundamentally, lines with longer heads are going to be easier to roll cast, easier to mend. You're just going to have more control over that line. And if you're fishing in tight conditions where you're roll casting all the time, that's going to be a really big help. And while if you're spay casting, you might think that that doesn't matter, that's actually not quite true. If you're fishing a long belly line, you're going to have a huge D-loop, and that's not going to be great for fishing in tight conditions. On the other hand, a short Skagit line like this one here from Rio, or a lot of the ones made by OPST, is going to be perfect for those really tight, really bushy steelhead streams. And last but not least, we want to think about water depth, time of year, and tips. Especially if you're going to be swinging on a single-hand rod, you're going to want to make sure that you've got an interchangeable tip system. I like these Airflow poly leaders for that. That's going to help get your fly down to those steelhead fast. And you're going to want to make sure that your line is weighted properly so you can cast your fly line with a big heavy tip on your rod. Make a few practice casts on your lawn before you hit the river. On the two-handed side of things, you're probably already going to be covered for your multi-depth and your tips. Because while you could fish a multi-density Scandi line like this one here, most people won't. This line requires a lot of extra effort to cast, and even still is not going to be fantastic at casting those heavier flies or getting it down really, really quickly. This is going to be a line for the advanced caster who really just likes Scandi casting. But all Skagit lines actually require a tip, so they're perfectly suited for those dark days of winter when you have to just get the fly down deep. And line manufacturers have realized that sometimes you need to get down even faster, so they've made multi-density Skagit lines like this Rio Game Changer here, and they work even better at getting your fly down super, super fast. So now that we understand some of the variables to consider in steelhead fishing, let's talk about some of my favorite lines. Like we already talked about, if you're fishing a single-hander, My favorite line is going to be the SA Anadro. And in particular, I actually really like the amplitude textured version of the Anadro. This is one of the few lines that I've tested that actually casts significantly better with the texture than the non-textured version. This line is great at turning over big heavy flies, and it still has that long rear taper to make it easy to mend and roll cast with. Lots of other brands have very similar lines to that Anadro. Rio makes their extreme indicator taper here, and that's going to fit into pretty much that same niche. On the two-handed side of things, we've already talked about Scandi versus Skagit, and I definitely prefer a floating Skagit line for most steelhead fishing. This Rio Skagit max power here is going to be a great all-around Skagit line. But truth be told, there's not a ton of difference between brands and tapers for Skagit lines. Most of that difference is going to be in length. So this line here at 450 grains, for example, is a 20-foot head, and that's going to be on the shorter side of Skagit lines, and that's going to make it easy to cast, easy to get down fast, and it'll also work well on shorter rods like a switch rod. On the other hand, if you've got a longer rod, say something in the 12.5, 13-foot range on up, you're probably going to want a Skagit head that's a little bit longer than this 20-footer. It's just going to make it easier to cast. And last but not least is tips, which are not really a fly line, but important to mention here in our Steelhead video. These tips by OPST are fantastic, and they come in a little bit shorter lengths than some of the other ones. But if you've got a reel line, there's definitely no harm in pairing a Mao tip, as those are also really, really excellent. And before we close out this video, I want to make sure that we touch on the most important point, which is finding a line that casts well on your rod. That's going to apply to both single hand and spey, but of course there's a huge range of lines and a lot of rods out there, and you're going to want to cast it before you get out on the water and make sure it's the right line for you. Tell us what your favorite steelhead line is by leaving a comment in the box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we've got a lot of great steelhead content coming right up. If you still have questions about choosing the right steelhead line, give us a call at Trident Fly Fishing at 888-413-5211 because we've got a full staff of fly fishermen ready to help. I'm Ben. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.